From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We begin today in Washington, where the United States Trade Representative yesterday submitted the annual report to Congress, which is the trade agenda for the United States of America. To sort of introduce us to that agenda, we welcome now Eric Martin. He covers international trade and economics for Bloomberg. So give us an overview, if you could. What do we find in this report, Eric?
Sure, David. Well, what we see are objectives set out for 2023 and underlining some new frameworks that the administration is working on, particularly those for the Indo-Pacific, the IPEF, for the Indo-Pacific region, and for the Americas, with the Americas Partnership for Prosperity, as well as initiatives to strengthen the relationship with allies in Europe. So on the one hand, this offensive strategy to negotiate new deals, standard setting, things that don't include changes to tariff levels and traditional free trade agreements. On the other hand, to focus on enforcement, particularly in North America. We have an ongoing dairy dispute with Canada, trying to get Canada to adopt the decision of a panel that ruled in the U.S. favor for dairy access, as well as with Mexico. Mexico's nationalist energy policy, as well as a ban on some kinds of genetically modified corn, are areas of concern for the U.S. With energy in consultations already, and corn potentially looking at that as an option to escalate U.S. concerns.
Eric, that's a pretty full agenda you've just described. At the same time, when we think about U.S. trade these days, a lot of us think about China, at least somewhere along that. Does the trade report give us any indication of any changes in our relationship with China?
David, it really focuses on the ongoing 4-year review of necessity, which is something that USTR launched last summer and has taken comment from stakeholders. That comment period closed in January. So now we're all waiting for USTR to review those comments and filings and to say whether these tariffs 4 years after they were first imposed by President Trump are still necessary, or whether they can be recalibrated, readjusted, some of them removed. So that's something that we're all eagerly waiting to hear from USTR.
Okay, Eric, thank you so very much for being with us. That's Bloomberg's Eric Martin, who reports on international trade. And now we turn to the trade representative herself, Katherine Tai. Thank you so much, Madam Ambassador, for joining us. So let's pick up on this report that you had. It emphasizes workers and everyday people. Explain exactly how that could inform your policies, the way you proceed in practical everyday life to really have that different focus.
Well, I'd be delighted to, David, and it's wonderful to be here with you today. The President's Trade Agenda report that we submitted this year, 2023, really reflects President Biden's vision for the American economy, which is to build the American economy from the bottom up and from the middle out. And that does mean absolutely taking into the forefront of our minds the interests of our people, our workers, our ordinary citizens, in terms of what kinds of trade policies and trade engagements are going to benefit our American citizens. So on that, I would double tap on some of the initiatives that Eric mentioned, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which we are negotiating in the Asia-Pacific region with 13 other countries. Here in North America, being responsible and vigilant stewards of the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade relationship, ensuring vigorous implementation and enforcement of those commitments, and then also with our partners in Europe, innovating new trade paradigms, in particular in the area of a global sustainable steel and aluminum arrangement. We are extremely busy at USTR and extremely committed to advancing a trade policy that helps to build and strengthen the middle class in America.
Let me ask you, Madam Ambassador, about two specific agreements that have been talked about. Don't have them yet, but one of them with the UK, with Britain, where we are on that, and the other with Taiwan. Is there any progress on that front?
Certainly. Let me start with Taiwan. We launched the U.S.-Taiwan 21st Century Trade Initiative last year. We have held one round of negotiations earlier this year, and we are making very, very good progress there. With respect to the United Kingdom, I think that we here in Washington and certainly at USTR observed the agreement between the UK and the EU at Windsor earlier this week with a great amount of interest. We will be following closely the finalization and implementation of that agreement. In the meantime, I met with the new Trade Secretary, Secretary Badenoch, in Switzerland. Last time I saw you, David, in January, where we committed to continuing the U.S.-UK dialogues on the future of Atlantic trade. So we will continue to pursue our ongoing dialogues with the UK while remaining very interested in how the Windsor Agreement is finalized and implemented.
You mentioned the Windsor framework a couple of times. Do I infer from that that it might expedite things a little bit? I understand you're not making a commitment, but actually that may be a potential roadblock that is being removed?
I wouldn't call it a roadblock, David. I think it is something that I know has been a focus of attention for the UK and also the EU. I'd just say that we have had a very long and special relationship with the UK, and the EU is also an extremely strong ally and partner of ours, which is naturally why we pay such close attention to that particular conversation. But with respect to working with Secretary Badenoch, I look forward to continuing to broaden and to deepen our collaboration.
Madam Ambassador, you mentioned Europe and the EU, how important that is. Where are we? Any progress report on discussions coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act? We know that there have been some criticism, some tensions, if I can put it that way there. Are we making progress in resolving those?
So our European friends have expressed their concerns about the Inflation Reduction Act. We take those concerns very seriously, as you know. We have been intensively consulting with and working with our partners in Europe, including through a task force set up between the White House and President von der Leyen's cabinet. On this, I would just reinforce the fact that in every conversation we have with the Europeans, we start with the shared commitment that we have and the congratulations that the Europeans continue to express to President Biden for this incredible piece of legislation, which is the most significant contribution that we as the United States and possibly any country has made so far with respect to responding to the climate challenge, which is something that we face collectively. So I am very confident that we will continue making progress towards a resolution, and we remain committed to working closely with Europe.
Madam Ambassador, when we talk with businesses doing business with China, one of the big issues is those Section 301 tariffs. They're under review right now. As I understand, you got the comments in January. Do you have any estimate about when you may have some decisions about those tariffs?
Well, as Eric said, we started the process on this review last fall. We closed the window on public comments just a couple weeks ago. We received thousands of comments from across the American economy. We take extremely seriously the responsibility that we have to work our way through those comments and to understand the interests of the different sectors and the different participants in our economy to assess the effectiveness of these particular tariffs. What I would say is let's take a couple steps back. In terms of the concerns of American businesses, an even longer standing concern has been the challenges that they have had with respect to respect and protection of their intellectual property rights and not being forced to transfer their technology when they are operating in or in connection with the Chinese economy. And on that one, what I would say is I think that the question that we all need to answer is how much progress has China made in addressing the concerns that underlie that initial Section 301 investigation. And that is something that we also are paying very close attention to.
And finally, Madam Ambassador, I want to return to North America. America. You raised Canada and Mexico in the USMCA. There are some issues with both of our neighbors to the north and to the south. Let me ask specifically about energy and Mexico. That issue has been pending for some time. Should we anticipate at some point you go forward with the dispute resolution mechanism under the USMCA to try to resolve that?
Look, we always are focused on moving towards resolution, and whether that is through political conversations, or moving through more formalized tools and mechanisms within the USMCA. I would just reinforce the commitment that we have as an administration, as a government, to addressing the concerns that we have with respect to Mexico's energy policies in a number of different areas, and that we will continue to work and to press to seek positive resolutions. I think that the North American energy relationship and the security for our three economies is of paramount importance, and that is something that we should be agreed upon between the United States, Mexico, and Canada.
Madam Ambassador, are the issues with Mexico growing? Because now there's a biotechnology issue, as I understand, as well, with some of the genetically altered food that's given to some of the cattle. Are the issues expanding, or are they totally unrelated? Is there a broader issue here with Mexico?
So there is a decree that was introduced on biotechnology a while ago, actually, so this is not a new issue. But it does signal a concern that we have that a very integrated market with ours with respect to agriculture, agricultural production, and a trusted and long-term partner of ours with respect to the science, technology, and innovation reflected in biotechnology needs to be safeguarded. And so this also is an area where we will be continuing to work with Mexico to arrive at a positive solution. But again, an area where we deeply believe that the tools and mechanisms in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement will be helpful and may need to be invoked.
Madam Ambassador, we truly appreciate all the time you've given us today. It's very, very helpful. That's U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai speaking from the White House. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Yesterday, the Congress moved to rescind a Biden administration rule coming out of the Department of Labor that would permit pensions to take into account ESG, environmental, social, and governance, in making their investments. To take us through exactly what the theory is behind that and where this goes next, we welcome now Republican Congressman Bryan Steil of Wisconsin. He is chair of the House Committee on Administration. So, Congressman, thank you for being back with us. So give us your perspective on exactly what was wrong with this Department of Labor rule, if you agree it was wrong, and what was it trying to fix?
Retirement investment decisions should be made based on risk and return, not a political agenda. And so the Department of Labor rule that is out, I think, moves us in the wrong direction. It allows the fiduciary to make decisions based on political leanings. We need to make sure we're protecting seniors and that those decisions are really based on risk and return, not an agenda.
So would you have an objection to saying you can take into account if you, the pension plans, think that in fact it does affect investment returns over the long term? Because pension plans, as you know, invest for the long term. And some people think over the long term, returns will be suppressed if people take too many risks with climate, for example.
Well, the fiduciary is still able to make a decision based on risk and return, and so there are going to be a whole host of risk factors that should be considered. What I am concerned about is whether or not we're going to see a political agenda being driven forward by these fiduciaries. If they can base it on risk and return, that's a very different analysis than whether or not an individual is investing based on a political agenda.
So Congressman, let's talk more generally about where we are, the economy, and particularly the budget. We're supposed to get a budget from the president next week, I believe, Thursday. We've got the debt ceiling looming out there. What's the right way, from your point of view, as a fiscal conservative, I dare say, what's the right way to go forward here?
So we need to get our fiscal house back in order. The president's budget under law was actually due the first Monday of February. It's already over a month late. The president's now promising it next week. What the challenge here is how do we get ourselves back in order? We need to have a hard look at the spending patterns here in Washington to get ourselves back in check, and also the economic growth. We should be unleashing American energy. We should be working to get workers back to work, to grow the economy. There's some policies that we need to dramatically change here in Washington.
And the debt ceiling, how close to the precipice will we come?
Well, the debt ceiling is an opportunity for us to come back to the table to have the adult conversation about how we have a long-term sustainable path to get out of the reckless spending that we're in. I think that as we move forward, what I would like to see is the president come to the negotiating table with Republicans in the House to say, what are the long-term reforms we can make to get out of the mess that we're currently in?
Well, if and when the president does present his budget, does that allow an opportunity for the Republicans to respond, House Republicans like you, respond in kind and say, okay, now this is what we're really talking about. These are some cuts we're prepared to make or propose?
Yeah, so the 1974 Congressional Budget Act says the president puts forward his budget, then the House gets to work to put forward our budget. This conversation is already a month late, all the more frustrating knowing that this summer we have a debt ceiling deadline coming our way. But instead of just looking at cuts, we also have to look at pro-economic growth policies that we can put forward. The two that are the easiest that we should be able to come together on is an energy policy that unleashes American energy and policies that actually bring workers who are still on the sidelines back to work. Those are the two pro-growth policies we could do to really address some of the fiscal challenges we face in Washington.
So Congressman, finally, you now are chair of the House Committee on Administration. Give us a sense of what your agenda is. What can you accomplish? What do you need to get done?
We need to make sure that we're bringing back accountability to the American people and getting Washington working again. As we look at the Committee on House Administration, we're going to make sure we drive forward with an agenda to make sure that the Capitol is secure but open and accessible to the American people. We're also digging into federal election law. I think there's some real opportunities to thoughtfully put forward policies that enhance election integrity and encourage folks to come out and vote, make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Inside of the Committee on House Administration, we have a ton of work in front of us, but I'm excited about the opportunity to chair the committee.
I understand you're just getting started, but do you have any going-in questions about the security of the Congress, the building itself, the Capitol, and where we might have fallen short, where we could do better?
So following January 6th, what we saw was a real Democratic narrative to look back as to what happened. What failed to occur was an actual after-action report to make sure that we're putting in place the policies to keep this Capitol campus secure, but also open and available to the American people. I've done a number of meetings with key stakeholders. We're going to have hearings on this topic in particular because we can secure the Capitol and keep it open and actually implement the reforms that have been suggested by multiple reviews.
So, Congressman, I understand that the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has released a lot, I think it's tens of thousands of hours actually, of videotape of what happened on that day to one Fox News reporter. I think we're going to maybe later this week have a report on that. Is that going to help reform, to have Fox News have access to that?
I think more transparency is good for the American people. We're having policies put in place to make sure when those tapes are turned over that we're balancing the security of the House, but also making sure that we're transparent. Under the previous Congress, under Nancy Pelosi, what we saw was tapes selectively released. I think additional transparency to the American people is always a good thing.
Well, then, do you think it should be released to everybody? You could actually just post it and let everybody in the country have a look at it.
So there is a thoughtful approach as to how we can release these tapes. What Tucker Carlson had access to was to review the tapes. Now we're going through the process of determining which tapes can be released. We're balancing out the security needs of the Capitol, but also the transparency for the American people. There's a thoughtful process we're putting in place. And I think at the end of the day, the American people will be well served by that.
Do you think we're spending enough money on security up on Capitol Hill? There was some concern that maybe we were understaffed.
We do have the financial resources, but we're also understaffed. There's been a challenge nationally to make sure we're hiring the number of police officers we need. I was just in a meeting with the head of the labor union for the Capitol Police here on Capitol Hill. We have an opportunity in front of us to make sure that we are building the staff up. The resources are more or less there. Now we need to actually implement the policies to make sure that this Capitol campus is both secure but open to the American people.
Congressman, it's always a treat to have you with us. I really appreciate your time today. That's Representative Bryan Steil. He's a Republican from Wisconsin. Still to come, we're going to talk with Republican Senator from Florida, Rick Scott, about where we are on the budget and the debt ceiling. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
This month, Bloomberg brings you the latest from China's 14th Annual National People's Congress, including China's COVID recovery, economic outlook, and geopolitical tensions. Coverage begins next week on Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, we're developing a bit of a pattern here. It looks like when we come to the market, once again, it's the bonds we're talking about, not the equities. And to take us through it, we welcome Kriti Gupta. So this happened yesterday. It looks like more bond story than stock story.
It is. And I think it's important to say that they're not necessarily in tandem here, because I think the story of 2022 was higher bonds, lower stocks, and they were directly responding to what the bond market was doing. This time around, you're not necessarily seeing that. Two different stories, two different asset classes. Let's start with the bond market, though. The 10-year yield, 4.08. It's a big deal when it comes to pricing the Fed, essentially, the next hike and what the terminal rate actually is. We know yesterday it was repriced to a peak policy rate of 5.5%. Today, you're now seeing parts of the market price in 5.7% even. And this is a really big deal for the bond market, because the way it shows up is an 8 basis point move higher on the long end of the curve. We're looking at the 10-year and the 30-year, and the 2-year inching closer and closer to 5%. And we know that 2 years really tied to the hip of the Federal Reserve. So any Fed speak here is really going to move the bond market. But for those of you who are not macro investors, you want to know how this affects the stock market. The answer is it doesn't really. And this is why this is significant, because a lot of the fears of the 10-year hitting that 4% level was that's the level that's going to spook the equity market. That is going to really kind of kick off some sort of next leg of declines for those who don't believe that the bottom of the carnage was in October. And here we are, only seeing the market down 0.3%.
Okay, so just take me back through that for a second, because I thought that if the interest rate goes up, the value of the stock goes down because you're discounting future cash flows. So why do they operate in different realms?
Well, because of this idea that the carnage was kind of overdone in 2022. The idea here simply being that what happens if you reprice the Federal Reserve, but a recession is not the base case, as it was in 2022, where a hard landing was almost a foregone conclusion.
So the theory is stocks have already taken their hit.
Right.
Essentially.
And therefore, they're not as receptive to the bond market because any changes in the bond market are already priced in.
Have they already taken their hit on earnings?
Part of it. And, it's interesting. I think Salesforce is a great example of this. The idea here that, and one of the major movers, by the way, why the Dow is outperforming the other benchmarks higher in the green by about 0.2%. And it's driving the gains because you aren't seeing as much of a hit. Look, it's the same buzzwords, macroeconomic concern, volatility. But at the end of the day, people are still spending, and business investment is still there, especially in a lot of those tech names. As
long as those consumers keep spending, that's what we need most of all. Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta. You can watch her again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time as she's being anchoring Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, Republican Senator from Florida, Rick Scott, will take us through the budget, the deficit, and what to expect when CPAC meets this weekend. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, we turn now to Lisa Mateo here with the first word. Lisa.
Thank you, David. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had a surprise encounter with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in India. Speaking to reporters in New Delhi afterwards, Blinken warned China against giving Russian military aid in its war in Ukraine, saying it would be, quote, a serious problem. Shares of Salesforce rose by the most in almost 3 years. The software giant gave a surprisingly upbeat forecast and will ramp up stock buybacks. Bloomberg's Emily Chang spoke to CEO Mark Benioff.
As we really focus on our performance, on our profitability, on the reprioritization back to being a core CRM company, it was really time to put the M&A committee on ice and just, mitigate what we've been doing with M&A and just focus more on our core. And it's part of the transformation that I've put into the company in the last 90 days.
Salesforce shareholders have pushed the company to cut costs following a half-decade of aggressive hiring and large acquisitions. FTX co-founder Sam Bankman-Fried is asking for leeway concerning his use of the internet and mobile apps while out on bail. He's already angered a U.S. district judge by using encrypted messaging apps and a virtual private network, which hides a computer's identity. Last week, federal prosecutors filed 4 additional charges against Bankman-Fried, accusing him of using FTX executives to make millions of dollars of political donations in hopes of influencing crypto regulation. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Well, Congress is back in session, which means we are talking once again about the budget, about the need to make some cuts, and also, of course, about that debt ceiling. Yesterday, we had the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer take another stab at trying to characterize what he thinks some Republicans want to do about things like Social Security.
They would push millions of Americans off Social Security benefits and raise the retirement age to 70. We have fought and struggled to get Social Security for people. It's harder and harder for them in their retirements to exist, and they want to cut people off Social Security.
So that's the latest from the Democrats. Let's hear from the Republicans, and particularly Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida. So, the Senator, I suspect you might have a different view about what the Republicans want. How would you respond to the Majority Leader?
Well, first off, that was a lie. What I and other Republicans are committed to is making sure we preserve all the benefits of Medicare and Social Security. I put out a plan, and that was part of my plan, to make sure we do that. And let's look at what's just happened in the last 6 months. I think it was in September. The Democrats, 100% of Democrats in the House and Senate, all voted to cut $280 billion out of Medicare to put the money in some of their program. They all voted for it. It was a direct cut of $280 billion. So, I mean, it's pretty hypocritical for Schumer to get up there and say Republicans want to do something that he actually does. And by the way, you know, when they do all this reckless spending, they've got to go back and try to fix it because it has automatic cuts to Medicare when they do all that excess spending. So I'm going to do everything I can to preserve Medicare benefits and Social Security benefits. We can do it. We can balance the budget. We can stop wasteful spending. I mean, David, as an example, you know we pay for 77,000 empty federal office buildings? 6% of the federal budget is not even money that's been authorized. So you look at this stuff and say, see, why don't we start by balancing our budget? Then we can make sure we can preserve the programs we care about, like Medicare and Social Security, Medicaid, things like that.
So, Senator, you mentioned your plan. Now, my recollection, you correct me if I'm wrong, you did have a plan that said we should regularly sunset these provisions. Doesn't mean we're going to eliminate them, doesn't even mean we're going to cut them, but we got to take a fresh look, sunset them. I understand you've backed off of that now. You're not proposing that anymore, is that correct?
Well, what I said is exactly what I meant. All I did was clarify it for the people that didn't, they're trying to act like they didn't understand it. So here's what you do. You look at your credit card every month. You look at your spending every month. We ought to be doing the same thing up here. We just pass programs, reckless programs. Who knows if we get a return? And we never look at them again. That's why we have $31.5 trillion of debt. So what I said is let's review all the programs every 5 years. I clarified for the people that wanted to try to lie about what I was saying, say clearly, programs like Medicare and Social Security, the U.S. Navy, that's not part of it. So, I mean, look, we do our defense spending. We don't fund it for 40 years in advance. We fund it every year. And by the way, here's what should bother you. There is actually no real trust fund for Medicare and Social Security. The money you pay in, every American pays in that has a job. There's no money sitting there. It's all lent to another department of the U.S. government, and you're hoping that future generations are going to pay for that.
Well, Senator, I don't want to get you in trouble with anybody up there or with your constituents, but actually, let me ask you, what's wrong with at least talking about the question of modifying some of the benefits for Social Security and Medicare? I mean, most economists we talk to say this won't work over the long term. You got to change something. But I understand right now where we've gotten with Republicans and Democrats is saying we won't even talk about it. Does that make sense?
I think first off, let's go to Medicare for a second. I used to be in that industry. There are ways to fix the delivery system that will reduce the cost, right? But I don't want to do anything that takes away the benefits. The same with Social Security. So I think the first step what we have to do is we have so much waste up here. It's the first thing everybody wants to do is to say, oh, you're going to do something to Medicare or Social Security. The first thing we say to ourselves is, where's all the waste? Why is 6% of our budget never approved, never authorized, and we just spend the money? Why do we have empty office buildings? Why do we have 87,000 more IRS agents? I mean, I could go on and on and on of just this wasteful spending. Let's do that first. And I think with that, and if we grow our economy, we forever can take care of Medicare and Social Security. But the other thing, David, we have to do, we've got to figure out how to grow this economy. And up here, it's all this increased regulation, all the increased permitting, the taxes and fees. It's really hurting the American economy.
Let me ask a different question. It's more political, perhaps. That's CPAC. That's having meetings this weekend. I saw reports that you're going to attend. Former President Trump will attend. Nikki Haley, I guess, will attend. A lot of people won't be attending. Has the role of CPAC changed for the Republican Party?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to be speaking today at 3, so you can tune in. And I'm going to talk about how our country is being destroyed from within. There's so many ways that we are doing things that you would never do to your family. And that's part of it. We're ruining the American family. We're giving people incentives not to work, things like that. We've got to go back to how this country was built. We were built on hard work, building American families, of faith in God. So I want to go back and make sure we have a country in the future that's a country where everybody, like a kid like me that grew up in public housing, born to a single mom, has every opportunity to succeed.
But does CPAC still have the same influence, do you think, with the Republican Party? Because there are some very prominent people who will not be there. Former Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, won't be there. Other people like Mike Pompeo will not be there. Is it changing its role?
Oh, I think it's got a lot. Well, here's what you're doing. It's an opportunity to talk to a lot of people that care about this country. And that's what I do. I mean, it's a great opportunity. There's going to be a lot of people there. I'm going to talk about what the opportunity is to make sure this is the country where you have an opportunity to succeed. So I think it's going to have a lot of influence.
Well, one thing I was really puzzled by, I was told this morning, I didn't quite understand it, is Jair Bolsonaro, the former head of Brazil, apparently is going to address CPAC. What is that about? I thought actually he was recovering from an illness in Florida, and obviously there was a big issue down there when there was an attempt to sort of take over Brasilia.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I had the opportunity to meet with him twice when he was president. So I didn't know he was going to be speaking. So I think it's important to do everything we can to support Latin America democracy and freedom. So I think it's very important that Americans understand the importance of Latin America, importance of getting freedom and liberty in Venezuela and Cuba, in Nicaragua, and making sure that Brazil has a democracy.
Finally, Senator, you mentioned a couple of things that are not the same thing. I'm not sure if they're at odds, but they're not the same thing. One is fiscal responsibility, really figuring out what we're doing with the budget, how we're spending our money. They're not wasting money, things that are pocketbook issues, if I can put it that way. And then there are values issues you also talked about with respect to CPAC. Which is more important to the Republican Party? Which is more important for them to pursue in your judgment? I know you're going to say both, but really, if I make you choose, where should the emphasis be?
Well, here's why I always think about it. It's very difficult to focus on anything else if you can't survive fiscally. So you've got to have a job. You think about, you want your kids to get a good education because that's your family's future, and you want to live in a safe community. But on top of that, it all fits in because we don't need wokeness in the schools. We need our schools teaching reading, writing, arithmetic. So I think it all fits in, David. It's all sort of together.
Senator, we always appreciate you spending time with us. Really appreciate it. That's Republican Senator Rick Scott from Florida. Coming up, we're going to go to the other side of Capitol Hill and the other side of the aisle to talk with Democratic Representative Gregory Meeks of New York about support for Ukraine and proposals to ban TikTok. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
TikTok, poses a problem and an issue. And so we have concerns about that as it relates to Americans' data, collecting Americans' data, and the potential national security risk. And we've been very, very clear on that.
This is Balance of Power, and that was White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre talking yesterday about a congressional proposal to ban use of TikTok in the United States. For his view on the subject, we welcome now Gregory Meeks. He's Democratic Congressman from New York and the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being here. There's been a lot of criticism of TikTok, a lot of concern, I guess, about the data that's being gathered that could go back to China at some point. As I understand, you have a slightly different point of view. What's your point of view on TikTok?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, David. And no, I think one of the things that we can say that we collectively have is concerns about TikTok. The question is, how do we resolve them? And what do we do? Well, we believe that the president has authorities now to protect Americans' privacy while we continue to look at national security concerns through the CFIUS process. And we want to make sure, and the problem that I have with the bill that was brought on the committee yesterday was the fact that we didn't take the normal time of having hearings and doing the kind of briefings that we generally have to make sure that we're doing the right thing at the right time, particularly before we have the CFRIS process and go through the type of information that we need, because otherwise it's entirely too broad as it was presented yesterday. That could hurt us and even damage some of our own national security interests with our allies. You have an app that over 100,000 Americans are looking at, but with the sanctions that are put place in the bill that was proposed yesterday, it could hurt many of our allies, many of the subsidiary American companies that would be subject to being sanctioned by this bill. So my position simply is, let us make sure that we're dotting I's, crossing T's, going at the center point of what the issues are, and let us let the process work to determine any other national security interests that violations that may occur before we move forward. But I would hope that we could do something in a bipartisan way. And I mentioned at the meeting that I thought that we could reach up to some compromise and some agreement, because one of the things we are concerned about is data protection for American citizens. And TikTok is a problem.
Congressman, does it stop at TikTok? We had Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, come in and talk with our bureau chief in Washington just today. And one of the things she said is it's not just TikTok. If you start down that road, there may be some other Chinese originating apps that would have to come into question as well.
But no, I think that, we've got to make that examination. That's why I think that, when we saw the Chinese spy balloon, here the administration, again, I think made the right decision of tracking it, following it, bringing it down where we could recover it and see what was contained therein. So there are a lot of concerns that we have with regards to China. The question is, how do we go about and making sure that we're doing so in a manner that is also reflective of who we are as a nation and our values, and working with our allies across the spectrum. Because when you're going to ultimately deal with China, it can't be the United States by ourselves. It's got to be the United States along with our allies, very similar to what we see taking place after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. You see all of our allies, the EU, NATO, staying together, working together. We need to do the same thing with regards to China with our allies, and even including our European allies there. But in addition to our allies in Asia, like Japan and South Korea and Malaysia, Singapore, those are all important allies, Australia, that we need to continue to work together if we're going to contain and make sure that China plays by the rules and stop spying on all of us.
Congressman, as you point out, there's been remarkable cohesion, if I can put it that way, of the U.S. with NATO and other Western allies with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Can we expect the same kind of cohesion within the House of Representatives? Because now we're starting to see some reports, and particularly some Republicans in the House, are giving administration officials a really tough time about some of the expenditures.
Yeah, I would hope so. I believe, that the responsibility falls on Speaker McCarthy to talk to his conference and those individuals who seem to want to go into a different direction. But I do believe overall that the majority of my Republican colleagues and Democrats can come together and agree that we've got to stick to it and stay with Ukraine and our allies in a very big way. So it is my belief that we will be able to move forward and support the president and support the appropriations that are necessary to give the Ukrainians what they need to fight the criminal war that is being put forth by Vladimir Putin. So, there's some Republicans, very definitely we hear that. And I hope Speaker McCarthy, a lot of it is on him because I don't know what he meant when he said that Ukraine would not get a blank check.
Right.
We've never given them a blank check. We've made sure we work collectively to do what they need to do to win this war.
Just last one on that blank check issue. What about some mechanism to make sure the money's getting spent the way we would want it to be spent? For example, an inspector general that maybe could be appointed with respect to the Ukraine funding.
Look, I've spoken to President Zelensky previously when I visited Ukraine. They have absolutely no problems with showing and giving, and they have been an accounting of how the money has been spent. I don't think that anybody has a problem with that. They have meticulously kept those records, so we know how. And I think that that's what would happen. I encourage members, if they have questions, they can go into the SCIF and look at some of it for themselves. And to document and to see that the resources that we're giving to the Ukrainian is being utilized in an appropriate and proper manner. The weapons that we've given them and the money that we've been giving them for humanitarian help has been appropriately accounted for. And I don't think anyone would object to that.
Congressman, thank you so very much for your time. We really appreciate it. That's helpful. That's Gregory Meeks, New York House Representative and ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Coming up, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo on TikTok and also beyond TikTok. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Earlier today, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo sat down with our Washington Bureau Chief Peggy Collins to talk about, among other things, the importance of the CHIPS and Science Act she moved to implement just this week.
The whole point of this is to increase innovation, research, and development in the industry. We're not giving you taxpayer money to fluff your pillow and increase your profit and give it away to your shareholders. We're giving it to you to invest in R&D.
And we welcome now the person who did that interview. She is Peggy Collins herself, our Washington Bureau Chief. Peggy, congratulations. Great to have you with us. So what did we learn, particularly about some of the, I will call them, they don't like to call them strings attached to this money?
That's right, David. So I did ask the Secretary about some of those, as you were calling, strings attached, where some of the rules and requirements that have come out this week that are attached to getting some of these billions of dollars in funding are, for example, making sure that if you're building capacity here in the U.S., that you're also providing access to childcare and other things like that. You're not, as the Secretary mentioned in that clip, necessarily that there are some limits on stock buybacks and dividends. I think one of the things that she said around the childcare issue is that what she's hearing from CEOs around the country is that they are still really struggling to find workers. And one of the things that the Secretary links to that and that she's heard about is this access to childcare, that a lot of women are not able to get back into the workforce or new jobs in the workforce that could come from this bill because of childcare. So as you heard her say, she does feel like they are very linked in terms of the strategy for rolling out this money.
So as you said, there's been struggles about childcare in Washington. There's also been ongoing struggles about TikTok and what to do about it. You also asked her about that, and I was curious about what she had to say.
That's right. So our colleagues here in Washington, Jenny Leonard and Eric Martin, wrote a Business Week piece this week where the Secretary said in that piece that she doesn't think a ban on a single company like TikTok is the way to go. So I asked her, well, if not that, what are you thinking? And she mentioned that it's not just TikTok that they have some concerns about at the intersection of national security and privacy. But she did also mention that they are working and planning to work more with Congress to come up with a strategy to deal with some of these questions. We also talked a lot about China writ large in terms of the dynamics of trade and also the intersection of our economies and national security.
Did she give you a better sense of what the Biden administration policy is with respect to trade with China? Because I'm not sure we all understand it.
Well, we did talk a lot about how the rhetoric in Washington, certainly even this week, is very negative, it seems, around China right now. But the Secretary has made it clear that her goal is not to decouple the two economies and that there are some areas of trade that she thinks can be promoted to the between the two companies. They have a strategy around personal care products, for example, but I do think that's something that's going to be a focus of theirs going forward.
Peggy, thank you so very much. That's Peggy Collins, Bloomberg's Washington bureau chief, who conducted that interview with Gina Raimondo earlier today. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminals, also online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll talk to Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.